The sun was setting over Los Angeles Airport, a golden glow spilling across the runway. Inside the bustling terminal, passengers hurried toward their gates, dragging suitcases, checking tickets, impatient to take off. But in the middle of all this noise, walked a man who seemed untouched by the chaos. A man the world knew as a superstar. Yet here he carried himself like a stranger in a crowd. That man was Keanu Reeves. No entourage, no flashing cameras. Just a simple jacket, a small carry-on bag, and that same quiet humility that had always set him apart. He approached the check-in counter, nodded politely to the staff and accepted his boarding pass without a word of demand. The attendant, recognizing him, smiled nervously, but Keanu only gave a small nod and continued. Soon he boarded the plane. The crisp air of first class wrapped around him. Leather seats, golden lights, quiet luxury. Passengers already seated lifted their heads in surprise. Some whispered under their breath, "Is that Keanu Reeves?" Others stole glances, nudging their partners, unable to believe that the man from the big screen was sitting just a few feet away. And yet, Keanu didn't seek their eyes. He quietly settled into his VIP seat, placed his bag gently under the seat, and leaned back, almost disappearing into the silence. There was no arrogance in him, no air of superiority, just calm. For a moment the cabin felt balanced, as if his very presence had softened the luxury that surrounded him. But balance never lasts for long. A flight attendant appeared at his side, her expression tight, her voice rehearsed. She leaned closer, almost whispering, "Sir, I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to be a mistake. We're going to have to ask you to move from this seat." The words seemed harmless, simple, professional, and yet they rippled through the air like thunder. The passenger across the aisle lowered his magazine. A woman clutched her pearls. Even the hum of the engines felt heavier in that instant. Keanu looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in them, no surprise, only silence, and the kind that makes people lean closer, waiting for what comes next. The attendant shifted nervously, then added, "This VIP seat has been requested by another passenger, a passenger who insists it belongs to him." Murmurs broke out. A whisper here, a gasp there. They're asking Keanu Reeves to leave? And in that charged silence, one question echoed across the cabin. The silence inside the cabin was sharp, almost unnatural. Every passenger seemed frozen in place, eyes darting between the flight attendant and the man she was addressing. Keanu Reeves. It didn't feel real. How could anyone ask him to move? The attendant cleared her throat, as if repeating the words would make them easier. "Sir, we need this seat for another passenger. He specifically requested it, and he won't sit anywhere else." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, as though she herself didn't believe what she was saying. From the far side of first class, a man leaned forward, a businessman in an expensive suit, gold watch glinting under the cabin lights. He gave a little smirk, the kind of smirk that said, "I always get what I want." Passengers noticed him. Some frowned, some whispered, "Who does he think he is?" "That's Keanu Reeves. Why would they even—" But the businessman didn't care. His eyes burned with entitlement. He tapped the armrest impatiently, signaling for the attendant to hurry. And in that moment, all eyes turned back to Keanu. What would he do? Would he demand his right? Would he reveal his status? Would he put this arrogant man in his place? Keanu sat there quietly for a few seconds, his posture still, his expression unreadable. Then, with a calmness that stunned the room, he gave a small nod. No protest, no anger, no single word of resistance. He simply leaned forward, reached for his bag, and stood up. The cabin gasped. Some passengers leaned forward, unable to believe what they were seeing. The businessman smirked wider, adjusting his tie like a king reclaiming his throne. The attendant stammered, "Thank you for understanding, sir." Truly thank you. But Keanu only gave her the faintest smile. A smile so gentle, it almost embarrassed her. He turned and walked slowly down the aisle, his figure cutting through the silence like a shadow. One passenger whispered, "Why didn't he say anything?" Another muttered, "If that was me, I'd never let them treat me like that." But Keanu didn't hear them. Or perhaps he did, but chose not to care. Row after row, he passed through first class, leaving behind whispers, wide eyes, and stunned silence. When he reached the economy section, the contrast was jarring. Narrow seats, cramped aisles, restless children, tired parents. And yet, Keanu's face softened as if he felt more at home here. He found his seat, a modest spot by the aisle. He placed his bag carefully in the overhead compartment, then sat down quietly. The passengers around him froze for a moment. Some stared. Some blinked in disbelief. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mom?" "That's John Wick." The cabin chuckled softly, the tension breaking for just a moment. Keanu turned his head toward the little girl and gave her a warm smile. Not a Hollywood smile, not a superstar's grin, just a genuine human smile. She giggled, hiding behind her mother's arm, and in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. Those who had mocked him in whispers now looked down in shame. Those who had admired him even more. And those who had doubted him realized that silence could sometimes speak louder than any outburst. Meanwhile, in the VIP seat, the businessman leaned back proudly, adjusting his cufflinks. But the eyes of the cabin were no longer on him. They were on Keanu Reeves, the man who had just given up a seat worth thousands of dollars without a fight. The irony was sharp, almost painful, because in surrendering the seat, he had taken the entire spotlight. And the question that now lingered in every mind was this. The hum of the engines grew louder, filling the silence left behind by Keanu's quiet surrender. He was seated now among the passengers of economy class, a section far removed from the velvet comfort of VIP. The seats were narrow, the aisle cramped, the air filled with chatter, the cries of a restless baby and the shuffle of people still adjusting their bags. But Keanu sat calmly as though this simple seat had been his first choice all along. Around him, eyes darted nervously. Passengers whispered behind raised hands. Did they really move him from first class? Why would he agree to that? If it were me, I'd fight. Some passengers shook their heads in sympathy, others smirked, convinced this was proof that he was just another man. But Keanu didn't react. He didn't frown, didn't sigh, didn't even look back toward the section he'd left behind. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, helping the elderly woman seated beside him adjust her seatbelt. Her hands trembled as she tried to clip it in place, and without a word, Keanu guided the buckle gently, snapping it shut. The woman looked at him in surprise. Recognition dawned in her eyes, but he only smiled and nodded politely, as though he were no different from anyone else. 2 rows back, a teenage boy stared with wide eyes. He nudged his friend and whispered, "Bro, that's Neo. That's actually him." His friend grinned, raising his phone as if to snap a picture, but then paused, because something about Keanu's presence demanded respect. It wasn't fear. It wasn't authority. It was calmness, and calmness is hard to look away from. Meanwhile, in first class, the businessman shifted arrogantly in Keanu's former seat, crossing one leg over the other. He sipped his champagne with satisfaction, casting a smug glance toward the cabin divider as if to remind himself that he had won. But had he? Because every whisper, every pair of curious eyes, every hushed conversation was no longer about him. It was about the man who had walked away without a fight. The irony was bitter. He had taken the seat, but Keanu had taken the respect. Back in economy, a young mother struggled with her child, the little girl from earlier who had recognized him. Her daughter was restless, kicking her legs, reaching for her toy that had slipped under the seat. Before the mother could bend down, Keanu leaned forward. With effortless kindness, he retrieved the toy and handed it back with a soft smile. The little girl squealed with joy, the mother's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Keanu shook his head lightly, almost embarrassed by the attention. "It's nothing," he said softly, but to her, and to everyone watching, it was everything, because at that moment the truth became clear. Keanu Reeves didn't need a VIP seat to be a VIP. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some passengers exchanged guilty looks, realizing how quickly they had judged him by appearances. Others leaned closer, eager to share the story later. "You won't believe what I saw on my flight." And through it all, Keanu remained silent, his calm smile never fading. Minutes later, the plane began to taxi, rolling across the runway. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and steady. But the passengers weren't listening. Their eyes still drifted toward the man in the aisle seat of economy. The man who had just been stripped of privilege, yet carried himself like the richest soul on board. It was a strange power, Not loud, not demanding, but undeniable. And as the plane lifted into the skies, passengers couldn't shake the same question echoing in their minds. Why didn't he fight for that seat? They didn't know it yet. But the answer was coming. And when it did, it would leave them all stunned. The flight was smooth, the seatbelt signs long gone. But the air inside the cabin was far from calm. Passengers in economy kept stealing glances toward Keanu Reeves. Some looked with admiration, others with disbelief. A few still shook their heads, muttering, "Why would he give up that seat? Maybe he's not the man people think he is." But the truth was far more complicated, and it was about to surface. Up in first class, the businessman lounged arrogantly, his champagne glass glistening in the dim light. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes, bragging to the woman seated beside him about his wealth, his influence, his connections. Every word was laced with pride, every sentence dripping with superiority. But what truly grated on the cabin's nerves was what came next. Loud enough for others to hear, the businessman sneered. Airlines should be more careful. Not everyone belongs in VIP. Some people don't exactly fit the standard, if you know what I mean. A hush swept through the section. The words stung, not because they were aimed directly, but because everyone knew who they were about, Keanu Reeves. Passengers turned their heads toward the businessman, then back toward Keanu, silently waiting to see if he had heard. He had, but he didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply looked straight ahead, his face calm, his eyes distant as if the insult had evaporated before it could touch him. The businessman, emboldened by silence, pushed further. That seat was never meant for a man like him. This is first class, not charity. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Even the flight attendant standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at Keanu's direction. And then, something happened. For the first time since the flight began, Keanu moved. He turned slowly, his calm eyes locking on the businessman in first class. The room seemed to tighten, the hum of the engines fading beneath the weight of his silence. Every passenger leaned in, breath held, waiting. And then Keanu spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. But it carried a gravity that silenced the entire cabin. Different, or less worthy. The businessman blinked, caught off guard. Passengers froze. The words hung in the air, simple yet devastating. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an argument. It was a question sharp enough to pierce arrogance itself. The businessman tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. I didn't mean... I just said some people don't belong here. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. And who decides where people belong? The silence that followed was unbearable. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding quietly in agreement. Others stared at the businessman, his arrogance crumbling before their eyes. One brave passenger muttered aloud, "He's right. Everyone deserves respect." A ripple of agreement spread through the cabin. The businessman, red-faced now, turned away, pretending to adjust his watch. But the damage was done. The spotlight had shifted, and Keanu? He leaned back in his economy seat, his face calm once more. He didn't push the moment further. He didn't humiliate the man. He simply let the silence speak for itself, because sometimes silence is the loudest response of all. For the rest of the flight, the cabin remained strangely quiet. The whispers that had once questioned Keanu's silence were gone. Now they carried admiration, respect, and perhaps a touch of guilt. Passengers realized they had witnessed something rare. Not anger, not ego, but strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need a raised voice or a privileged seat to make itself known. And yet, as powerful as the moment was, it wasn't the end, because the true revelation was still to come. The cabin had fallen into an uneasy silence. The businessman sat stiffly in the plush VIP seat, his smugness cracked but not completely broken. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in economy, his simple question still echoing in the minds of every passenger. Different? Or less worthy? It was a question no one could unhear, but what none of them knew was that the story was about to turn in a way they could never have imagined. The flight attendants huddled near the galley, whispering nervously. One of them, a young stewardess, pulled out the passenger manifest and frowned. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "Seat 1A was assigned to Mr. Reeves, Keanu Reeves," That's what the system says. The chief purser, an older woman with sharp eyes, snatched the list from her hand. Her face paled as she scanned it. Oh my God. You're right. He wasn't in the wrong seat. He was in the seat reserved for him. Shock rippled through the small group. They turned their eyes toward the man sitting humbly in economy, a soft smile still resting on his lips as if nothing had happened. The purser straightened her uniform, her heart pounding. She knew what she had to do. Moments later, she stepped into the aisle, her voice louder than usual. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Heads turned. Conversations halted. Even the arrogant businessman in first class raised an eyebrow, curious. The purser took a deep breath, then bowed her head respectfully toward Keanu. Mr. Reeves, please forgive us. There has been a mistake. That seat, the one you were asked to vacate, it was yours. It was always yours. In fact, it was reserved under your name before this flight even boarded. Gasps erupted across the cabin. A child clutched her mother's arm. An elderly man shook his head in disbelief. The businessman froze, his face draining of color. Passengers began whispering fiercely. Wait, the seat was his all along? They took Keanu Reeves out of his own seat. This is insane. But the purser wasn't finished. Her voice trembled now, filled with both awe and shame. Mr. Reeves, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize. We did not recognize you immediately. We failed to treat you with the dignity you deserve. Please, allow us to escort you back to your rightful seat in first class. All eyes shifted to Keanu. The entire cabin held its breath. Would he accept? Would he finally claim what was his? Would he use this moment to shame the man who had mocked him? Keanu looked at the purser with calm, steady eyes. And then he smiled. It's all right, he said softly. I'm fine right here. The response was like a thunderclap. Shock, admiration, disbelief. The purser blinked rapidly, struggling to hold back tears. Passengers shook their heads in awe. The businessman, the man who had demanded Keanu's seat, sank lower into the leather cushion, his arrogance dissolving into pure humiliation. Because in that moment, the truth was undeniable, he had fought for a seat. But Keanu had earned the respect of an entire plane. A man seated nearby finally spoke aloud, his voice trembling with emotion. Sir, forgive me for saying this, but you gave up your place without protest. You let yourself be humiliated. Why? The cabin leaned closer, hungry for his answer. Keanu's gaze softened. His voice, calm as ever, carried through the silence. Because a seat is just a seat. But dignity, that's something no one can take from you, not unless you let them. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through every heart in the cabin. Some passengers bowed their heads in shame. Others nodded slowly, tears brimming in their eyes. Even the child who had been restless earlier grew quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment, and in that instant, Keanu Reeves, the man forced from VIP, became the true VIP in the eyes of everyone on board. The businessman buried his face in his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His expensive watch, his tailored suit, his stolen seat, all of it suddenly worthless. Meanwhile, Keanu leaned back in his narrow economy seat, calm and at peace. The applause began softly, a clap here, a clap there, then grew into a wave that filled the entire cabin. They weren't clapping for the airline. They weren't clapping for wealth or power. They were clapping for humility, for grace, for strength that spoke without raising its voice. And though Keanu didn't ask for it, didn't want it, the respect, the admiration, the gratitude, it was his, because in choosing humility over pride, he had given the passengers a lesson they would never forget. The applause inside the cabin slowly faded, replaced by an atmosphere thick with respect and reflection. Passengers shifted in their seats, their expressions softened. Even the restless hum of the engine seemed calmer, as if the entire plane had bowed to the serenity of one man, Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly in the narrow space of economy, had transformed what began as humiliation into a moment of truth that no one on that flight would ever forget. The purser approached again, still visibly shaken. Mr. Reeves, please let us at least offer you something. Anything you'd like. A better meal, a drink, extra comfort. It's the least we can do. Keanu shook his head gently, that calm half-smile resting on his lips. Thank you. But I'm fine, truly. The purser hesitated, then bowed slightly before stepping away. Her eyes glistened as though she had just been given a lesson her years of service had never taught her. Across the aisle, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is everyone clapping for him?" "He's not in the big chair anymore." Her mother leaned down, her eyes moist. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes the biggest chair doesn't mean you're the biggest person. Today you saw what true greatness looks like." The girl nodded slowly, glancing back at Keanu with wide, innocent eyes, the kind that absorb lessons and never forget them. As the hours passed and the plane soared across the night sky, the tension that had once clouded the cabin had been replaced with quiet reverence. Passengers who had never spoken to each other began whispering in hushed tones, sharing the story of what they had just witnessed. The businessman, however, sat in silence, shrinking deeper into his leather seat. His once proud posture was gone. His expensive watch glinted uselessly in the dim light, a symbol of status now drowned by shame. Finally, the captain announced the descent. The city lights glittered below like scattered diamonds as the plane began its gentle drop through the clouds. When the wheels touched the runway and the aircraft rolled to a halt, the passengers began to stir. Yet no one rushed to disembark. For once, people were not thinking about themselves. They were waiting for him. Keanu rose from his seat, quietly adjusting his jacket. The entire cabin turned their eyes toward him. He looked around, at the businessmen and women, the families, the children, the elderly couple who had defended him with their eyes, if not their words. He saw in them not just curiosity, but a longing to take something more than just a flight from this experience. He paused, then spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried through the cabin like a clear bell. "What happened here tonight," he began, "wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about money or titles or status. It was about how we see each other, and how quick we are to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Silence gripped the cabin. No one dared move. Keanu continued. "The truth is, every one of us carries a story the world can't see. Some stories are written on our faces. Some are hidden deep inside, and too often we forget that appearances don't tell us the whole truth." He let his words linger, then glanced toward the businessman in first class. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with a quiet compassion that felt heavier than any judgment. The world will always try to tell us that our value depends on where we sit, what we wear, how much we own. But I can tell you this: true worth is not in the chair beneath you, but in the heart within you. A murmur swept through the cabin. Some passengers bowed their heads. Others wiped away tears. Keanu looked down for a moment, then raised his gaze once more, his eyes soft yet steady. "So if you leave this plane with one lesson, let it be this. In a world where you can choose to be anything, choose to be kind. Because kindness is the only currency that never loses value." For a heartbeat, the plane was utterly still. And then, applause erupted again. Not polite claps this time, but a thunderous wave of appreciation, raw and genuine. The businessman did not join. He stared at the floor, his arrogance reduced to dust. Yet even he could not escape the truth. He had been taught a lesson without a single insult, without a single raised voice. As Keanu stepped off the plane, passengers rose instinctively, parting the aisle for him like a pathway of honor. Some whispered thank yous, others simply smiled with tears in their eyes. And as he disappeared into the terminal, the story remained behind, etched into the hearts of everyone on board. For they knew that night, they had not just witnessed a famous actor, they had witnessed the power of humility. They had witnessed the strength of kindness. They had witnessed what it truly means to be human.